it's a pleasure to be here and to be with Natasha and with Joel. As they said, we've known each other for well over a decade, and we have been talking about these issues of the importance of rule of law throughout that time. And before I go into a few prepared remarks, just to give you context for why AT&T cares, most people are familiar with the U.S. presence of AT&T and the diversified things that we do here. But in addition to that, the work that keeps me busy is that we are active all over the world. And in our bilateral relationships that we've had for decades and with the roaming relationships that allow you to be able to communicate and connect in all but about 4 jurisdictions around the world, there's a lot of work involved in that, and rule of law comes into that. We also have presence where we operate with our own license and our own entity in around 70 countries, and have significant operations in Mexico with mobile business and throughout Latin America, where the DirecTV Latin American pay TV business is. So it's a very mixed business, very internationally oriented, and so these issues of rule of law, I think about it a lot, because it's fundamental to our very ability to operate and our investment decisions. And that's a bit of what I want to talk about today. You know, and just as a framing thought, some people think of rule of law in a very academic sense sometimes, but it's very, very pragmatic. It's a core part of business strategy. It is something that business leaders and strategists have to think about very carefully at the early stages of market entry, market competition, and to be vigilant about throughout. It's a value that we have to preserve in developed markets, and it's something that we have to work very hard to strengthen in emerging markets. Weak rule of law attracts weak strategy, attracts weak market performance. And we have seen that. Some of the examples that Joel talked about have been very much in the news in recent times. It just exemplifies some of the concerns that can happen when that's the case. But to begin as a grounding point for some of you not as familiar with what we're talking about through a law, I think definitions are helpful. Just, on a basic principle, rule of law means that all government officials and citizens are bound by the law, they abide by the law, and the law is enforced in a non-discriminatory manner. And in addition to that, and I'll take a little bit of time to read it, I particularly think the UN definition is a good one. It's one that I base a lot of my thought and work about. And the UN says, it's a principle of governance in which all persons, institutions, and entities, public and private, including the state itself, are accountable to laws that are publicly promulgated, equally enforced, and independently adjudicated, and which are consistent with international human rights norms and standards. It requires, as well, measures to ensure adherence to the principles of supremacy of law, equality before the law, accountability to the law, fairness in the application of the law, separation of powers, participation in decision-making, legal certainty, avoidance of arbitrariness, and procedural and legal transparency. Extensive, but it covers the bases. And so I commend that as just a guiding text to come back to as you're thinking about these things. So I've already mentioned rule of law is consequential. This is not ethereal. This is an issue that affects the very governance and opportunity of countries. Where the rule of law is weak, medicines fail to reach health facilities, criminal violence goes unchecked, laws are applied unequally, and foreign investments are held back. And conversely, effective rule of law reduces corruption. It drives truly competitive markets, improves public health, enhances education, alleviates poverty, and protects people from injustices and dangers large and small. As I've said already, and as I experience all the time, rule of law does correlate to foreign direct investment. And this is an important message, particularly to emerging markets that are constantly thinking about how to make their economies attractive to stable and predictable investment. Experienced companies carefully study the quality of rule of law in markets. And as a strategic planning matter, this does correlate with investment decisions. I see that firsthand all the time. There was a recent study that was done by the Economist Intelligence Unit. They looked at Forbes 2,000 companies and asked them about the conditions most important to their investment decisions. And in that, strong rule of law, it was one of the top 3 factors on a very long list. I can share with you the study, which I thought was an interesting one. It followed only ease of doing business and stable political environment as a priority. And then within that, the most important rule of law factors to this group, the top items were corruption, political or social instability, risk of physical security, and lack of transparency of regulatory or legal rulemaking. So this certainly matters to companies, large and small, and it should matter to all countries that are seeking to attract investment. As I've already said, it matters to AT&T. It's not only because it's the right thing to do, it's also good for our business, it's good for the pride of our employees. We've set up structures within the company to ensure that our beliefs and our practices are very tightly adhered to. Within our Chief Compliance Officer group, which is a direct reporting officer to our Chairman and CEO, we have a global trade organization that works daily to ensure thorough in advance due diligence, to ensure compliance with trade laws and regulations throughout our supply chain, not only in the company, but the whole supply chain. Example, I mentioned already our Mexico business and investments. When we came in and entered the company, we instituted comprehensive training for our employees, as well as a very clear escalation process, and both of which are intended to encourage and enable this compliance. Shifting back again to the bigger picture, the rule of law affects all of us in our everyday lives. It's a foundation for a system of rules to keep us safe, to resolve disputes, and to enable us to prosper. Meaningful and long-term development depends on upholding rule of law. The party invests itself at its peril in a country where corruption is rampant, property rights are ill-defined, and contracts are difficult to enforce. Beyond this, of course, the reputational consequences go far beyond losing your investment in that market. Uneven enforcement of regulations, corruption, insecure property rights, and ineffective means to settle disputes undermine legitimate business and drive away both domestic and foreign investment. To a dynamic private sector, it's necessary for sustaining economic growth and strength, and the ability to play this essential societal role is hampered when there is a lack of effective rule of law. And finally, just a word about what we could call corporate diplomacy and values. And that's the role that business has across sectors as a horizontal matter in the work that we do. And again, this is something that's been interesting to us as a company as we've entered certain markets. And sometimes you might expect that our entry into that market would be something that wasn't welcome. We often hear that the business practices that we bring will be helpful to the market, to the institutions around, and it's a high standard. So there is an important role, you could call it corporate diplomacy, in connecting people and economies. Economic integration and cooperation is central for tempering international disputes. And this work, with many of the markets that are presently underinvested, depends on these efforts to strengthen rule of law and create opportunity. Working with a set of ethical and business values needs to cut across geographies in a consistent way. We need to promote the merits of the rule of law with economically rational investments prevailing, and the role of the rule of law as one of the most important elements for growth of a society. For AT&T, as I've said, we work all over the world, and we're proud to bring the power of connectivity and to live in this intersection of technology, economic, and societal policy on a daily basis. And today, the work of the International Leaders Summit to bring attention to this foundational issue is highly commendable. I'm just very pleased to join you today and to be part of this conversation with everyone.